Thank you, Andrew. I think veteran, that's a bit grim, isn't it? I don't think I'm a veteran. Lovely to see everyone, and welcome to today's international keynote. I'm absolutely delighted to have Nancy Dubuc with me. As Andrew said, she presides over one of the most significant cable and satellite networks in the world. Many of you will know that Nancy came up through the programming route and along the way managed to transform the History brand, but also launch extraordinarily exportable titles from porn stars through to things like Duck Dynasty, then became chief executive in 2013, and again has presided over a creative renaissance in that business as well, bucking the trend that we've seen around backing premium scripted and very much doubling down on non-scripted with a whole new array of exportable hits, many to be seen on Channel 4, from Married at First Sight to 60 Days in Jail. It's been an extraordinary tenure, and today we're going to be talking a lot about how A&E are dealing with the disruption we're all experiencing, but also, I hope, touching on what you've done to create a really remarkable creative culture at the heart of the business. We're going to kick off by having a look at what A&E have got on air.
Are you willing to give up who you are for what you will become?
There's a story here to be told. I'd like to be part of that.
If you have the right mindset, it's amazing what can be accomplished.
Be prepared to be amazed.
What are we waiting for?
Never regret the things you do, regret the things you don't.
We get in, we get out. We ask for forgiveness later.
We fight for more than just this city. We fight for the Grail.
We are selling true love here. True love, people.
Do you think I'm gonna make it? I think you should keep going.
You will never touch him again.
The good life, may we all live the good life.
I'm not going to be intimidated. The church will get exposed.
It's proof that the original story is true.
Do I like who I am? Of course I do.
You will be working with models of all sizes.
One size does not fit all.
There are no greater rivals than the Wahlberg boys.
Accepting our wager.
You're in bad trouble.
It could be us and us.
I cannot think of a better way to show what law enforcement officers go through on a daily basis.
We're about to embark on a wilderness survival experience.
It's gonna be my wife.
You will be judged by this wedding.
Your blade will kill.
You have to look at this as an opportunity to change your life.
What I experienced growing up, it was my outlet to express myself creatively.
The greatest indicator of the world's stability is the status of women.
We went through years of evidence and found that one piece that was overlooked.
They just kept grilling me. They're getting really suspicious of me.
I'm fighting like tooth and nail to not snap.
Got the dead guy's wallet in here. It's got blood on it. What are the odds?
This isn't just any SUV. It's the SUV.
If this is a real deal, this could be worth millions of dollars.
Our goal is to show the world a window to understanding why people do the things they do.
That's kind of a beautiful thing.
It's an amazing tape, extraordinary amount of fantastic.
I hadn't seen it.
Hadn't you? It's brilliant. You've done a good job. One of the things that really struck me when I watched it, there's a fantastic line very near the top from Nightfall, which is a big drama you're launching, an A&E Studios item. And it's this: are you willing to give up who you are for what you will become? And I thought that was oddly totemic of what you've had to take on in the past few years. You have shifted that business creatively in all sorts of interesting ways, launched FYI, thought again about the sort of mix of scripted and non-scripted. When you look at that, are you happy with where you are creatively? Is that what you wanted it to look like?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's always work to be done, and you and I were talking about that. The curse as a programmer and a creator, you're always looking for that next thing. But to your point of imagining, what you can be, I'll often say to the team, we're in the business of putting ourselves out of business, and that you always have to be iterating. And if you look at the DNA of A&E Networks, it probably began as far back as, I think it was on 2003 when we lost Law and Order.
Yeah.
And A&E at the time had been a top 2 network, but it was predominantly rented broadcast programming. And overnight we went from number 1 or number 2 to number 30. And we had no choice but to reinvent the model for ourselves. And then that began the original programming, sort of investment and the ownership path that we were on. Same thing again happened at History, sort of dare to ask what this can be. And here we are today, dare to ask where are we going? And sometimes it's all about asking the question.
Of course, exactly. And fascinatingly, as Gary was saying, John Landgraf talking about peak time for scripted programming, lots of people saying we're piling in, we're making more and more expensive drama. And you've gone in a completely different direction and built on the credibility you've got in the non-scripted space. Was that a very deliberate decision? I mean, you've reduced the number of hours of scripted, and has it
I think it depends on the network. I mean, as a company, we've actually increased the number of scripted, but for A&E specifically, we talk a lot about know thy audience and know who you're programming to, and we're not just in an arms race, a content arms race for the sake of being in it. We're really there to serve the consumer and that super fan that we have. And the reality was that, A&E always had a drama or two on, but it felt very disconnected to what the core of what they were doing. And, in a way, just because John's been referenced, they do a lot of boundary pushing scripted, and A&E has always done a lot of boundary pushing unscripted. So we're a little bit the FX of unscripted. So just own it. And own who you are.
But let's talk about that, because actually one of the reasons that it's been fascinating from a Channel 4 point of view to see this resurgence in where you are creatively is that lots of those shows are very punchy for the American market, and they almost speak to a British tradition of public service broadcasting, big issues of the day that you want to say difficult things about. Was that very deliberate that you wanted to go into that much spikier space?
I think we've always been there, and it's, we quickly sort of forget our history and our heritage, but the very first show that I greenlit at A&E a long time ago was actually a British show, Airline. And, at the time that was considered even a little racy. And, intervention was one of the 3 times I've been told you may lose your job. And okay. And it's become a huge darling and an Emmy-winning series, and about a tragic subject, but important. And I think, dare to go there has always been the unspoken at A&E, but specifically now, I think we're articulating it more and owning it versus let's just sweep a couple of these very controversial shows over here, and then as they grow, we can figure out how to position them.
Even with the pedigree you've got, there's been, I think, to quote Spinal Tap, a sort of dialing up to 11, isn't there? I mean, I know you and I both had the Church of Scientology, coming to give us a visit, and obviously there was a controversy that you had with the KKK program as well. So I mean, what I'm fascinated by, particularly for a commercial broadcaster, what's the conversation like with the commercial team in that situation? Are they saying, Nancy, really, do we have to do this? I mean, are they with you every step of the way because being noisier in this way is driving subscription?
And by the commercial team, you mean my ad sales? Or?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because, often you have people in an eye rolling, really, do we really need to go there? But they're backing you every step of the way, and they can see that there's palpable value in being noisier.
In the commercial side of the house, I will always use their phraseology back on them that sex becomes love with ratings. And violence becomes conflict, and that it's very difficult, and it's my job as the creative leader and the business leader of the company to push people outside of their comfort zone. We don't always get it right, and we have to have a reason for doing it. I don't think we do it to gratuitously do it. Every one of those shows that could be, put on the list of, wow, this is really a risk. It's, we have a reason for doing it. It's putting a mirror back on society of what's going on.
Which is, again, speaks very much to a British public service tradition, that. But actually, one of the most striking successes you've had on A&E recently has been a show called PD Live. I don't know if anyone's seen it. There was a bit on the tape.
Yeah.
Which is literally a live show following police chases, police raids. I mean, pretty much unmakeable, sadly, in this market. But it's been a massive ratings winner for you.
Massive. So and it's actually a massive innovation as well in terms of how to allocate capital. No surprise or no secret that the United States has had some issue with law enforcement and race and what have you. And we came up with the idea of, just put it out there for everyone to make a decision. and that continuing to foster the conversation is part of our responsibility. And don't edit, and don't, and we immediately said, well, no police department will do this. Yeah. And one thing led to another, and we got a bunch of police departments to do this. And the team looked at it very specifically as, okay, we'll do 20 episodes, it'll be like a summer run, and I said, no, it should be 52 weeks if this thing's gonna work. And I think that's been really, significant change for them. It's Friday and Saturday nights. It's the #1 or 2 show on Friday and Saturday nights in the U.S.
And in Gold Dust terms, it rates very well as a repeat as well, doesn't it?
Very well as a repeat. Well, we actually cut it down to a highlights for the repeat. Yeah. So we're amortizing the production over 2 nights because the crew is sort of contained and up and running. Then we're able to cut different versions down. Surprisingly, the live show definitely rates higher, but it's repeating, which has surprised us a little bit.
But it's an interesting area because live television feels a bit of a dying skill in all sorts of markets, actually. It's difficult to do. There are few people who are able to make it. So to be able to do something like that at scale is fascinating. Can you see yourself?
Yeah, I think you have to be careful that it's not live. Live is not what's making it work. Yeah. It's the suspense of, I could be watching something that's going to go horribly wrong any second. And fortunately, that doesn't happen every episode, something going horribly wrong. And I think that anticipation and that suspense of it. We also tried Date Night Live on Lifetime, and that didn't work. Yeah. Because it wasn't additive to the story. Yeah. So live for live's sake, with the exception of sports, I don't think is a wise path. Yeah. But live, where it contributes to the tension, we have found. I should
just ask, because there are producers in the room, and I should think what's fascinating about the growth you've had in this area is it speaks to an area of huge strength in this market. I think the British market's very, very good in the non-scripted space. So on behalf of those who wouldn't mind a commission or 10, are there any particular tips for British producers about coming to you, or things that you and your team are actively looking for?
Don't come to me with the 2.0, or my team with the 2.0 version of what we already have. Yeah. And I think it's very hard for producers, and I'm always trying to encourage the community that just the way that we run our day-to-day jobs, we're already 18 months ahead. So we're already trying to look around the corner of, what are some of the issues facing society? What are some of the trends? What are we seeing a lot of in the media landscape right now? So inherently, I feel like when you see a lot of one thing, 18 months from now, the audience is going to zig to something else or zag to something else that you don't want to. We've never been the pile-on effect. And I think being the first show out there takes a lot of guts. Being the 15th version out there is a business model.
That's exactly right. Now, one of the things that's striking when you look at that is the sheer range of risk-taking. I mean, we were talking earlier, it's delivered a lot of hits in a very short period of time. But that speaks volumes about the creative culture that you've created within your team. And I'm fascinated about how you've done that. I mean, you talk a lot, this great line, if you're truly fearless, you will fail and you will grow from it. And I think a lot of people pay lip service to that, but they don't actually do it. What have you done that has allowed your team that space?
I think some people on my team would say I haven't been giving them that space lately. I think celebrating failure is key. And, what I always say is if you fail spectacularly, you'll regret looking back and go, oh, I wish I had done X, Y, and Z with that show, or I wish I had pushed, or I wish I had this or that. Half of what we do fails, at least, and that's a pretty good batting average if half of what you do works. No one sets out to make a bad show, and I think there's such bravery in just putting one foot in front of another, not really knowing what you're making. And even if you think of your own personal hobbies or craft, you don't really want to do that with anybody else or have anybody watching you do it, but that's what essentially we're doing every day. And keeping the teams alive, also recognizing and respecting that each of the brands have their own unique culture too, and not trying to fight against that.
Have you, in a sense, incentivized people to fail, by which I mean given them the scope to be able to do things, there's no fallout if they don't succeed? Because I think creatively we have a tendency
I think it's more the mantra and the culture, the tone that the leader sets. I mean, you'll get fired for doing nothing, you won't get fired for a show not working. Yeah. And that's what I sort of say over and over and over again.
One of the things that's striking about the way you talk about creativity, and it's become unbelievably unfashionable now, is to talk about gut instinct. So sort of in the era of SVOD, giants talking about data and the value of data, you still talk about gut instinct. How did those two go together for you now when we've also got access to so much information?
You know, I mean, look, the information is helpful, and a lot of big platforms and a lot of big companies own a lot of information about consumers, and they own a lot of data. You know, we don't aspire to own the information. We aspire to own the hearts of our customers. And that, you know, data can point you in the right direction of topically what may or may not work, but it can't tell you how to tell a story. And I think we've all been using data for a very long time. I mean, Modern Marvels is what told me to do Ice Road Truckers. Yeah. There it was, over and over and over again, repeating. It just took someone to look at it and go, how do you think bigger? And that a lot of times the data is in front of us, but we're not graduating it to the creative process.
But the interesting thing about the transition you've made from a creative role to chief executive is you're now presumably sitting in a boardroom where explaining gut instincts is a bit trickier, isn't it? Because you, in my experience, you get finance people going, well, that's all right, love, but, you know, what's it actually going to... So how's that transition been for you? Because you're working in a very different environment now.
Yes, very different. Disney and Hearst are very different as well. You know, honestly, I don't get challenged on defending my gut instinct. I think that goes with 15 years of, you know, pedigree or experience at the company, and you're either going to trust me or you're not. And it's my responsibility as a CEO to deliver the bottom line, and when I don't deliver it to your satisfaction, you'll make a decision. Yeah. But right now, if I'm in charge, we're not, you know, who are you, Mr. CFO or Mr. Strategy person, to tell me what's going to work and what's not going to work.
I really hope you don't say it like that, do you?
No.
That's bad, Nancy. No. It's going to get you in big
trouble. But, you know, nobody would have said, yeah, a bunch of guys who make duck calls is going to be bigger than American Idol. Yeah. It just wouldn't. Yeah. No focus group would have told you that. Data wouldn't tell you that. And certainly a boardroom wasn't going to tell me that.
So you talked about the board, and it is an extraordinary dynamic, that, isn't it? You've got two very different businesses with very different expectations, presumably, and different cultural touch points, I suppose. How is that? How do you manage that?
I think it's difficult for anyone in a JV. You know, it's, you know, different goals, and you're just balancing that. They started this company 35 years ago on a very, very, very small investment. You know, NBC at some point was in there as well, and we divested them, bought them out, and so it's a true 50-50 right now. I think, you know, the way you manage it is just in performance, and if we're performing, they leave you alone, and if you're not performing, then they don't leave you alone.
So simple when you put it like that.
And just owning that, and I think, look, we have had the great opportunity to have had the success that we've had, and so by and large, I think we're also there to the way that we've made digital investments and the way that we've made strategic investments in small companies. It's not necessarily to tell them how to run their business, sure. It's to learn from them. Yeah. And I think sometimes we underestimate the learnings that are coming out of our company into their companies.
Sure. Just on the performance piece, because actually clearly when you're in a board situation, and I know this running a portfolio myself, I think there's always a problem child, isn't there? So bits of it are doing brilliantly, other bits of it are doing less well. When you're talking about the performance of the entire group to the board, how do you explain the highs and lows? Do you think it's cyclical? Do you think it's structural? Or how are you navigating that slightly?
I mean, it's a little of both. I try and reiterate that there's a difference between a business cycle and a creative cycle, and that they can very quickly get caught up in, you know, that network over there that's owned by somebody else has better ratings than you. And it's like, well, yes, and 3 years ago, I had better ratings than them. And, you know, there is a cycle to this. There's an oversimplification of, you know, where's the next hit, or I want my Game of Thrones, or I want this. I mean, you know, we were joking, I can't go to a Walmart in aisle 12, halfway down on the 4th shelf, there are hit shows. I mean, that's not realistic. And I think you have to work at almost giving them more information and educating them as to why things are changing and where trends are going. You know, frankly, in our boardroom, we spend more time talking about the impact of disruption and what strategic things are you doing about that, more along the lines of ad sales and affiliate negotiations, and then you always show them a little video to make them happy.
It's a masterclass in managing a difficult board. I want to go on and talk about diversification, but just before we do, one final thing. I mean, the interesting thing when you look at the performance now is you're experiencing something, and a lot of other channels are, that some of your female streaming channels are struggling a bit. And there are highs and lows in history, and A&E's had a really good year, but, you know, the female screen channels are finding it. Do you think that is a proper disruption, or we're seeing a shift in behavior there? Is it going to get harder and harder to court that female demographic?
I mean, I think there's a lot of content out there for the female demographic. And so history, to some degree, benefits from very clearly defined brand, very clearly defined topic, and a clearly defined category with, a decent amount of white space around it. A&E as a boundary-pushing network and designed to be a boundary-pushing network, as long as it's continuing to find that next sort of hot property or that talked about show, that's a hard cycle to always be in the hit machine cycle, but that's the business they're in and that's the business they have to be in. Lifetime, we've had some highs and lows. Some of it has just been post-merger. We acquired Lifetime in 2010. I like to say this a few years ago, but it's 7 years, so I run out of that excuse of it's a hangover of the merger. But it really, is talking to a very wide audience, and movies are appealing to a very specific female, the unscripted and reality, another, the scripted, another. And you have to recognize which audiences are coming into the brand that are new, which are old, and how are you balancing that through the transition. But really the main point, I think, for the business and for the room is that in the States, there are double the number of networks programming to women than there are to men. And I think it's very tricky to, it's easy for the board to say, well, add makeover shows. And I always point out the number one.
I want to come to your board meeting.
The number one show for women in the United States is Walking Dead.
Yeah.
That's not a makeover show. Yeah. I mean, it is kind of, but not really.
Okay, so having had that glimpse into what sounds like a hell-raising board meeting, I mean, of course, the real frustration from a creative background as we are is there was a time, I mean, sadly I never lived through it, and you probably didn't either, where you could have an array of hits and sort of put your feet on the desk and say, brilliant, 2 or 3 years' time, come back and I'll give you a few more hits. And we're not in that market anymore, and actually a key part of what you need to be thinking about constantly now is the disruption that this conference is about, but also about diversification of income and how you break out of some of those problems. So I suppose, the killer question really, I suppose, to you is the phrase skinny bundle must send shivers down your spine, does it?
It hasn't, look, the ecosystem is being disrupted, no question. We've had a fair amount of success being in the skinny bundle. I think part of the equation when distributors are thinking about this is there's the sports to sport or not to sport, argument that's going on in the States, and everyone is pretty divided on that. But then there's a price point that many businesses are trying to hit, whether that's a $40 price point or a $20 price point or a $10 price point. And when you start to really get to that lower end of the bill, the billing that they believe where there's a market, and then you have to balance making that small bundle for $15 popular enough, we kind of organically fall into it because we're cheap enough because we don't have sports and we don't have broadcast retrans, but we're delivering across the 3 brands a very diverse audience at a real value, a price-value ratio. So, we've seen some success in that. Oops, that's me again, I'm sorry. Yeah. It's going to get trickier. Some bundles are just going for sports and broadcast. It remains to be seen whether that will be a positive or a negative. And then we're seeing the new startups, the virtual MVPDs. So while we're seeing declines in some sides, we're seeing increases in the other. The increases have not offset the declines yet, but we have a ways to go on that trend line.
And to what extent, in that moment, do you love your board? Because by the very nature of their investment profile, it gives you leverage on the global stage you wouldn't have otherwise had.
We act independently.
No, I do not love my board.
I do love my board. Please don't take from here. I don't love my board. They're wonderful. But we act independent. We represent ourselves. The interesting thing about a JV board is that there's a little bit of a church and state because they may not have the same objectives.
Sure.
And so Disney represents its portfolio independently, and they do not include us, and we negotiate our deals independent of them.
I suppose the sort of philosophical problem which sits at the heart of all this is how potent will channels that are predominantly driven by repeats be in a landscape where there's just so much stuff? And it's a key part of the economic of a bundle like that, isn't it? So does that worry you?
We've been trying to get away from the repeat business. In prime time, we're pushing our percentages of premieres constantly. That's why, yes, live PD is working from a audience standpoint and isn't that fabulous and great for us, but now Friday and Saturday nights for 50 weeks of the year, 45 to 50 weeks of the year are premieres. And so you're able to create a consistent habit for that viewer that we're there, we're always going to be there.
But you've also been very open about the fact that if there's a sort of arms race in scripted, increasingly there's also massive inflation in non-scripted and reality as well. So to populate a channel with a much higher percentage of origination is a sort of bankrupting proposition, isn't it, at scale?
I think we've been able to balance that pretty well, and I think you do that through the genres of programming. So the movies, for instance, are not unscripted, but they repeat quite well on Lifetime. So at least in terms of bucking the trend of repeatability, that's been okay for that brand.
And a key part, and actually quick plug for Chris Curtis because it's in broadcast today, we've all been reminded of the fact that in a sense you're ahead of your time in taking your content off Netflix, that you realised that you needed the value in that repeat stock and therefore you're not putting it out to the SVOD players. Just talk us through that, because in some respects that was ahead of its time in terms of anticipating the end point being that you are less relevant to consumers on those brands.
Look, they have an incredible business, Netflix, and I think all of us are a bit envious of what they have and what they're able to spend. But for me, it was really a behavior, and when we did have a library arrangement with them, and you're starting to see, you do get some information about your video starts, and it just, the way people were consuming our content on Netflix was not on par with the way we were being valued by Netflix. And so right there, it was an easier decision for us to say, that money isn't worth the risk that we're taking of creating a behavior to not watch commercial television.
So would that extend to Amazon as well? Are you effectively pulling back all of the content because it will be what future-proofs
We've
your
done
business?
more piecemeal things with Amazon. We have a better relationship with Hulu vis-a-vis hours of programming, because 75% of the audience that's watching on Hulu is still watching with commercials, a commercial experience. So for me, it's about the audience behavior. You want to preserve, there's going to be, we all watch SVOD and things without commercials, but we all also tolerate commercials in some environments because you care about that brand or that show, Bake Off being one. You care enough about it that you'll stick with it. You don't want to become sort of good enough, is what I've called it, where that you'll tolerate watching the 2 seasons ago content because it's available on a service that doesn't have commercials, versus no, I'm gonna go seek it out because I love history or I love those Lifetime movies, and I know I can't get them anywhere else anyway. So it's not that we don't want to work with those companies, but on a library basis, the math just doesn't work.
Just one final point there about co-production as well, because I think we are all riding this cycle of money coming in from SVOD players, taking the money and then thinking, well, where does this all get us in the short to medium term? So if you pull back on the library, do you still imagine yourself having relationships with them growing franchises, or are you very keen to grow your own?
Scripted's a little different. We tend to deal with each show individually. We're keeping a close eye on what would the value be if we kept the shows for our own platforms, and you can only get them inside the wall on our own platform. I don't think we're there yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see it. You also are starting to see in the States some ideation around affiliates commissioning original programming and wanting to compete a little bit. I think it's going to get very hard for the consumer to know where stuff is.
Exactly.
And so it'll probably all aggregate back again. Is where it's going.
But critically then, one of the other vital things that you've done is to set up the studio, because you wanted to be invested in your own future. Now that's, you've got shows coming through that like Roots, and can you see that getting to scale? I mean, what sort of part of your business do you think?
I think it's a more bespoke approach. We know what we want for our own brands, and so we wanted more control over the development pipeline and the scripted pipeline in terms of what history needed and what Lifetime needed. We also believe that we can sell and be completely at arm's length and disconnected from our brands and have, just be a passive financial investor to generate another revenue stream. And we're starting to see some traction there in terms of pilots and scripts being picked up by some of the SVOD players, more so them than competitive cable outlets. But I think, we're going back to the days of you're going to have to go to a lot of places to amass the budget to compete with the quality and the scale that we're all seeing in scripted programming right now.
But you're growing that IP base, and the studios is one part of that, but of course the other part of it is your investment, and memorably you have invested in Vice, and a lot of people in the room enjoyed being patronised by Shane when he was in Edinburgh last year. So I think
I get it every day.
I certainly would love to know your take on that. I mean, it's been, in a sense, it absolutely embodies the dilemma we all have. It's delivered a very pure demographic for you, but hasn't delivered scale, and yet along the way you've learned a lot about how you serve content to young audiences. Is that a success for you?
I think absolutely. Unquestionably, I would say it is. It's talking to an audience. It's a chicken and the egg. It's talking to an audience that doesn't watch any television, but I would argue we're not giving that audience much television to watch. And so the challenge is now getting the distribution of that brand up. We've, by some of the skinny bundling and the tiering, had a little bit of a distribution setback in the States, but when I look at the audience that it's serving, it's one of the most upscale, youngest audiences on cable now.
But this point you make, which I think is sort of turned shivers around the room, that we probably collectively are guilty of not making great content for that audience. Yeah. That's quite a thing to say. What do you think that is? Is that we've just lost touch with that demographic?
No, I mean, I think we were it, right? We were the birth of cable, and I watched that first video on MTV, and all of cable felt like it was made for us. Yeah. Like, here it is, everything I care about, not broadcast. And so, it aged with us. And we didn't do a great job of listening to the generation that's coming behind us, and how do we need to reinvent ourselves for what they care about.
And has having Vice in the stable informed how you then take that across to other brands? Do you think you've got better antennae for young content?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the Vice thing was, it was in the frenzy of buying production companies, which, we just weren't going to be in that game. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. And in making the investment in Vice, which would have been pretty equal to buying a big production company, we were getting an agency, we were getting a studio, we were getting a digital platform, we were getting a cult of personality, we were getting, a lot more diversification inside that investment.
Yeah, we definitely saw the cult of personality.
Than we would be getting in just a production company.
But you also talked interestingly at the time about that holistic approach made you think differently about your own business, and you then set up 45th and Dean Street, so that you're now in that space. And is that because you think there's sort of money in them, their hills, that if you can make that connection in ad-funded and
I think some of it is that we all have to figure out how to control our own destiny to some way. With this much disruption going on, and people pointing different directions and changing strategies on a monthly basis, that, I know what I need to do, and I know who I have to serve. And that goes from a distribution partner to an advertising partner to my audience, that, if I see things coming around the corner, like a push for branded entertainment, or, direct to client selling, where that's becoming more prevalent, where CMOs want to have conversations with CMOs, then I need to build the capabilities to do that. So one of the things that we talk a lot about at A&E is capabilities. That we had 10 great years where we only had to be capable of 2 or 3 things. And now, we have to broaden that out. And we are storytellers at heart, and we are creators at heart. So the DNA of doing it is there. But now comes the discipline and comes the courage to, go into different businesses and create in different ways for different platforms in a way that we maybe didn't have to before.
I see, and Lonnie, we're running out of time. I'll put it out to questions in a second. But one thing that strikes me is if you were going down your sort of tick list of things you could do to diversify your business, you're in IP, you're investing in production companies, you're thinking about closing that circle in terms of ad-funded. But it has been a period of profound disruption. Do you now feel that you future-proof the business in the face of those digital giants, or is there a huge
I think the
amount
day
more to
that
do?
you feel that you future-proof the business, you haven't future-proofed the business.
Good point.
I mean, I think it's changing, and it's constantly, fail fast, kind of a cliche, but of looking at the decisions that we make on an annual basis or semi-annual basis and say, this thing's not working, out, next, and having the courage to do that. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about courage, and that's admitting failure, and hard for people, but I do believe in the fail fast.
Do you think coming from a creative background has made you better at that because you're used to being on that roller coaster ride of risk taking?
I think so. I mean, you and I both know that a lot of what we do doesn't work, and that I'm still here, I'm still standing, and maybe someday I won't be. But the risks that I'm taking now are probably far greater than a single television show. But I have the the fortitude to sort of manage through it with my team.
Yeah, brilliant. Questions? Young Kenton Allen. No, I think there's a mic.
Hello, Kenton Allen, a producer. Can you talk a bit more about your your scripted strategy and how that works with your increasing international strategy?
How scripted and international connect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how
I think,
I think you're growing more here. So what's the ambition for scripted?
The ambition is great. I mean, I think I'll use an example. We've put an enormous amount of money both in the license fee and the marketing and the support of Vikings. And it's a very important show worldwide. But I don't believe that we're participating the way that we should be for what we had a very, very heavy hand in creating. And so we don't want to make that mistake again. And it's not that it was a mistake. I don't think we would have jumped in and started a studio before Vikings to the way that we are now, because it was unproven whether we could really deliver those audiences and be seen that way. We had Hatfields before that. So it's about making wise choices in terms of the audience that you're speaking to. It goes for me to the history brand, and that the history scripted content has enormous capabilities to travel globally if we pick our subjects right and we pick our shows right. And the competition is less. On A&E, a more general entertainment focused network, we'd be competing with everybody from ABC to Netflix to Channel 4 to Sky, and that's going to be more difficult. So sort of know thy audience that you're super serving there and double down for that audience. The Lifetime movies and being also a very important area for us to be focused on. But I don't ever want to be known for just one genre. I think it's very important for us to be diversified, whether that's, nonfiction, documentary, live, scripted. That's what's been our savior all these years, when being able to zig when others zag. And if you look at the media portfolios in the US, most of them are really one genre or the other, not both. And
you see more scripted coming through the studio then, in some sort of arrangement?
In some sort of fashion. I think to not come through the studio would be a little bit of the exception. And I think we have to be more innovative with deal making if it's not going to come through the studio. Because the model of me paying $3 million an hour license fee and I have to make it all back on ad sales isn't going to work.
That's not good for you, Kenton, I'm thinking. That sounds a bit of a closed door. Next question. Yes. Can you say who you are?
I can. Peter White from Broadcast Magazine. Hi, Nancy. You've talked about and been involved in buying back control of many of your international joint ventures, most notably recently in Germany. I just wonder whether that will extend eventually to the UK with A&E Networks UK with your partners in Sky.
I mean, we have an incredible partnership with Sky. Jeremy and I have gotten to know each other quite well over the last couple of years, and I think that that's an example where we're trying to make 1 + 1 = 3 with Sky. We see opportunity in growing some of the assets that we now wholly own more with them. I'm not going to say much more than that, but the going from JV to O&O has really been about controlling our own destiny and being able to, invest where we want to and invest aggressively. When you're in a joint venture, there's always a little bit of conflict in the local partner seeing as much value in the brand as we see. And we really, really believe in the international market. It's a huge area of focus and it's a huge area of growth for us as a company. Sean Cohen likes to say, my very first day on the job as a CEO, I went to our in-house international conference. And I didn't know a face in the audience, and it was a little nerve-wracking, but that is one of my top 3 priorities as a CEO, the international market.
And critically, you're not pulling back from the Sky relationship?
Absolutely not. So that was a little bit misconstrued out of context that I saw some reporting today.
We do one final quick question, 3 at the back. Could you say who you are?
Hi there, Ian Moffat from ICM Partners. I was just interested to hear that intervention is one of 3 times you've been told you might lose your job. What were
The other two? One was an independent film called Jesus Camp that we did at A&E. And I marched in and I said, I want $1 million to do this film. And she said, you're going to lose your job. And fine, you got the $1 million. And we did it, and I didn't lose my job. And I thought I was going to lose my job over Kennedy's. I got really dogged and stubborn. And I got a phone call from a very powerful person at one of the partners that gave me very sage advice that I have passed on to some of my executives. It's just a show.
This is a brilliant session we should do next year, which is moments when you thought you were going to lose your job. And everyone can just come up and go, there were 5 or 10 of you. Nancy, you've been absolutely amazing. Can you put your hands together for Nancy Dubuc?